All right, thank you everyone for gathering here for today. It seems that this is our kind of I wouldn't say a concluding talk, but a talk that we somehow are building up upon past 3 meetings organically, so to say, arriving from at the title, but also about thinking what is the common point between the 3 pavilions which we have in here, of course, in conversation: the Austrian pavilion, Cyprus pavilion, and Philippine pavilion. Maybe something that has to be said for the record also, for the audience that will see it in the future, is that the title Collapse of Scales, of course, was the moment when we arrived at it in a way in the beginning, but gradually we found out that this is very much something that is a ground of the connection linking maybe linking the pavilions based upon the simple idea of the horizontality, simple idea of the surface of the table, but surface also as a kind of platform, as a open horizontal space to collaborate, to participate, but at the same time as a kind of horizontal space in the Philippine pavilion in which the whole process of collaborating between the community and the architects is somehow presented in a form of also horizontal structure of the pavilion in a way. Collapse of scales comes from the understanding, I think, that we attempted to think from the non-hierarchical approach, thinking that each scale is equally important, but at the same time that each scale can be equally related to another one. When we are approaching the subject from the territory, from the settlement, or from the dwelling scale even. So from that point of view, as we agreed before, maybe let's head up into the very brief presentations on of the works in your pavilions, and also how do they relate into the exhibition and into the subject of the horizontality itself. Shall we begin maybe with Carmen and with the idea of the platform urbanism and platform Austria? That is the subject of the exhibition. Carmen, I think you are having muted microphone.
Oh yes, muted. Yeah, no, thank you very much. I mean, I can just talk a little bit about the idea behind. I think we've kind of spoken about this in the past, but the subject of the exhibition is looking at the impact of digital technologies on built space, but more than that, kind of what that impact says about the entanglement between urbanism and technology and capital. And we're really interested in how there is a particular architecture of participation, so an architecture of conviviality, of sociality, of networks that is really, really permeating the way that cities are being produced and the way that people inhabit those different city spaces. And at the crux of the issue, there's this dilemma, which we've spoken about in the past, which is where these architectures that are based on, again, this horizontality, if we use that word, or I don't know if we can call it a horizontality, but the sense of kind of circulation and of movement and of being together in a space, are actually creating these small isolated enclosures within urban spaces, where if one has access to those spaces, they're granted the privileges of this kind of more fluid and horizontal way of relating to one another, of relating to digital space, physical space, one another. But again, that's all mediated through a series of gatekeepers, which becomes very extractive and exploitative in its impact on the way that we inhabit cities, and the effect that it has on, you know, everything going down to kind of decisions in terms of city governance, to access to public services, and lots of kind of other different features. But at the same time, because we have new spatial relations forming from this sense of kind of these horizontal participatory infrastructures really shaping the way that cities are being produced, there is a bleeding edge, if that makes sense. That's kind of a term we use. There's in that space of entanglement, there's a lot of potential for intervention, or there's a lot of potential to rethink the way that you understand what a city can mean, or how you relate to one another in a city. And our idea behind the exhibition is really trying to intervene into that bleeding edge. How can we reappropriate the platform? How can we kind of re-signify a participatory architecture? How can we understand, if we're really positioning ourselves within these relationalities, how we can begin to create cities or create environments that are truly not, I mean, it sounds a little bit essentialist, but like are really, you know, based on this sort of sense of like horizontal interaction and providing kind of more equal spaces for everyone. And so our way of doing that is to kind of do a performative exercise of turning the Austrian Pavilion into a platform itself, and as well engaging in lots of different other types of platform organizations. So being involved in the CC, and yesterday organizing a series of 6 different panel discussions and events, and being involved in something like this as well, is really trying to embody these different platform architectures that we are critiquing on a sort of research level, but at the same time trying to kind of embody and understand and study. So in the sense, the Austrian Pavilion, just by being here in Venice and existing now, we are kind of still in evolution about what our ideas are on the subject. We're still kind of, it's an active research process. So that's something that I would say, just to introduce a little bit about the idea. And I think yesterday it was really interesting because, throughout all of these discussions, we invited over 20 of our exhibitors who had taken part in this blog platform, had kind of taken part in this performative exercise. And they all came physically to the pavilion, and we organized these discussions throughout the day on the subject of platform urbanism, platform capitalism, urbanization of technology capital. And it really felt, again, if we're thinking about the way that the exhibition is still like an ongoing research study, it really, really felt reassuring, and it felt, just to like put it really colloquially, it was just a fantastic and amazing kind of experience to have everyone there in person talking about these ideas, presenting that online, and really feeling that, again, I think that when talking about platform capitalism or platform urbanism, the metaphor of the platform really has to be taken seriously. And the problem is not the platform itself, but it's who's naming the platform. It's who's dictating what the platform means, who's creating the conditions for these kind of horizontal architectures to exist. So that's why I'm really excited to, as well, kind of that our 3 pavilions are in conversation with one another, because we are all kind of naming platforms in a different way, which becomes really important. So I don't know if that's a good bridge into maybe someone else to.
No, thanks, Carmen. That's really perfect. I was also participating there, and I had the pleasure to see also the whole process, how indeed the pavilion became, in fact, a physical space for the exchange, and platform, like passing from the digital to the physical, I believe, is the kind of very important ground of mediation between some local things and small local elements up to the digital. So that leads us to the Cyprus pavilion, and Nasius and Eva, and your approach to the presentation of the anahoresis.
If you can share screen, we got Marina and the Vahoras here, our co-curators, and
yeah, it's interesting, Carmen, how you speak of the physicality now of the platform, and how like the platform becomes now like a gathering space, and it's been activated through like a series of events and discussions. In the case of the anahoresis project, we wanted to explore distancing, whether it is enforced or voluntary, and how distancing can become a paradigm for exploring new forms of socialities and gathering spaces. And we wanted to see how also anahoresis becomes like a word, a notion, where we can explore its metaphorical, but also its literal meanings and definitions. So we started looking into the experiences that occur through an abrupt jolt of departure. So we sort of defined different points of departure through this notion, which was explicated through a series of lectures in the 70s by Roland Barthes. And we wanted to see how we really depart into new realities, into new spatial configurations. In this sense, we had a dual question that was posed since the beginning when we started exploring the project through the lens of the pandemic also. So in a way, it was sort of an opportunity for us to view the domestic landscape and the interior living through urbanism, in the interior on the one hand, and sort of understand our micro scales and our cities, and making like more like public space and a more intimate and human space on the other hand. And here is another photograph of Agoras to explore. You're new to
Sorry, hi. Yeah. It is like we started with this notion of anaphoresis, which means literally to move into new modes of cohabitation. So then it became very important for us to look at this question of distances as something that is positive and can be operative, especially in this through this concept of the platform that is happening, because we wanted to create this horizontal surface that is the table that would sort of be activated through events, but also through what is hosted on it. So for example, there are different objects like the ones produced by these women that you see in this photograph, which is a cooperative of women in Cyprus who creates these tablecloths and these ornamental objects that they that then go on and travel and become essential in generating localized economies. So for example, this would be generative of income for the village of Lefkara. So then we started looking, so this links very much into question of cooperativity and collectivity. So we are trying to think this in between like the local and the global, and how the collapse of the scale is something that is very much happening, but how can we talk about it and contextualize it and still keep this element of what's happening local, like the localized distribution of resources. And it links to what Carmen was saying about who are the gatekeepers and what's happening and who is extracting profit, who is sort of pushing the discussion forward and how. So, yeah.
Another image from our research, again, looking into the idea of scales. This is something that we found in Nicosia. It's the new town hall situation where you have the archaeological site right below the new building. And for us, there's kind of three different scales. There's the infrastructural one, kind of very straightforward and pre-planned. There's the archaeological one, which relates to a kind of more intricate spaces. And there's also the social scale that was introduced by the builders here with the introduction of a table, like which is very immediate. So we were interested in these ideas of DIY-ness versus something which is completely structured and pre-planned. And with the evolution of cities as a relatively new concept in a way, if we look at the larger history, like we became really interested in this idea of scales and intricacies that are introduced by the users. And this was the kind of initial concept sketch, again, having this idea of the scale in mind and the existing space of Spiazzi, which is the culture foundation we work within. We used it as a framework, literally as a geometric framework where we could introduce all these scales as one big gesture. But at the same time, we treat it as a wireframe where objects and different narratives and different thematics could be embedded within this fragmentation and again, the notion of gathering. Something that really inspired us was early drawings from John Hayjuk and the archipelago of islands and micrographies, which you can see kind of developing in our cartography of the plan. The space of Spiazzi is divided in 3 rooms, and that's how we treated the exhibition itself. Room number 1 is the kind of entrance, and it it prepares you before you enter the exhibition. There's a kind of interactive negotiation of space with pivoting elements, and then you enter into kind of these micrographies into the courtyards and with different thematics. And room number 2 is where we've gathered models from different collectives and other emerging architects like us, which also discuss the idea of living together and gathering and cooperatives and working together. Again, like the idea of the surface is recurring, I guess, as the virtual platforms. In our case, we chose to really highlight this idea of distancing and proxemics and fragment the surface itself. So the project was kind of catalyzed by the pandemic, and as Cyprus had an open call during the pandemic for the project, we decided to highlight this with the idea of distancing. Ira?
Yeah. So the exhibition is sequenced in 3 stages. You have let me see if I can go back. You have the legs, which is the 1 layer of the exhibition. You have the tabletops, which is the 2nd layer. And you have the objects which are embedded on the table, which is the 3rd layer. So with the legs or the piling, obviously they're the support structures of the table, but it also, for us, it became an opportunity to look at, well, basically they showcase the raw materialities of Cyprus, and we started a research on this for the lasted, I think, a year and a half, where we looked into the natural kind of soils of Cyprus, from the coast to the plain to the mountain. Obviously, you have the copper and iron kind of deposits and the natural pigments that come out of the soil. And for us, the reason that this came about is, so Cyprus is a very small island with a lot of politics, and usually it's depicted outwards towards the world in a very nostalgic almost way, or it can either be through the lens of tourism with the sandy beaches, or through the kind of political situation, which is the buffer zone. But if you take all that away, I think everyone who lives or has lived in Cyprus, whether that be the north or the south, we all relate to the island through the place in itself, like the materiality, the raw materiality of the island. And this is the kind of commentary that we wanted to make. The tabletops, visually, kind of the design of the table references the proto-settlements of Hierokitia, which are these, it traces these circular forms of the language for collective living. But also, like Nasios said previously, it was the beginning of COVID, and we were looking at proxemics, the distancing directive of the 2 meters, the personal space, the public space, how that starts to become emphasized. And then the objects that are embedded on the table, we call them activators, because for us, it was important that the table, it wasn't just a piece that was showcased. As mentioned previously, there were events happening in the space before. There was a community already there. And we wanted the table to be activated for people to spend time in the pavilion. So the objects are divided into 3 sub-categories. You have the infrastructure, we call it, where you can just plug in your computer or your phone and stay there and work. You have the play, the element of play, which are the games of tabli or puzzle with a kind of this element of chance and interaction. And then you have the category of craft, which is like these vestigial objects, which reference this kind of collectivity of the cooperatives that Marina was mentioning before, of people coming together to create these kind of socially sustainable economies of making. Like, for example, the Kuposanido, where people used to come together with the neighborhood to make the bread and share the oven.
We have a couple of photographs which showcase the architecture of the table. And yeah, I think there's also a lot of things to talk about and kind of unpack from the objects, but I guess someone could visit our website or our Instagram account and find out more. These are some more photographs from the contributors projects exhibited in this kind of circular typology, again, re-highlighting the idea of gathering together.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No, thank you very much, all four of you, for this brilliant explanation about the complexity of the project. I believe that the catalog is also a fantastic element that helps to somehow unpack precisely like all the details about each object that is up there, about its somehow history, and maybe the way that it is rooted in the local culture. And somehow this, I think, helps also to understand the importance of the local cultures, which I believe for you also made a point in this presentation. So that somehow maybe the aspect of the local cultures also leads us to Alex and Sudar and their work in the Philippine pavilion with the traditions of Bayanihan and Dugnat. So Alex, Sudar, I'm passing to you now.
Yeah, so thank you so much. It's so nice to be here, talk to everyone. Well, I mean, this cultural tradition, which is the topic, we're looking at mutual support in the Philippine Pavilion, which is a kind of platform also where people meet. It's been practiced throughout centuries. It predates market economy. It's been a way for people to organize themselves in the face of disasters or even just in everyday life. But there's a bit of an organizational structure to it. But what's really interesting us is a little bit how these traditions exist with different names in different cultures, and also kind of expressed in certain ways that although they're not always the same, there is something that's very similar across these traditions. And that's what we're trying to understand, is how can these traditions, or what is it that we share across cultures, and how can this inform the way we create architecture? Anything you want to add there? Or
yeah, so the topic of the title of the pavilion is Structures of Mutual Support, and it is exactly specifically dealing with these structures of mutual support. And I think so we're showing you some examples of what mutual support means in different cultures. Like in the Philippines, it is called Bayanihan, and this is a tradition where people do literally carry the house from one farm to the other, and in the time when someone else needs to move their own house, the villagers come together and help you move your house as well. So it's like a mutual form of sharing, also of labor and collective activity. And in other countries, also like in Norway, it is about, let's say, changing the roof or fixing the roof. Similarly, in Japan, it's about rethatching the roof as well. And even in Chile, the tradition called Minga, they help each other move house from literally over the water, as you can see in the first point. So we are exploring how these traditions have same principles together, and how these principles can inform the way that we build together. Because we really think, like the question, how we live together, it is also a question of how we can build together. And these traditions are like ways of building together that have already existed, and it might serve as a way for us to kind of rethink and learn from, so that we can build together differently in the future.
And it's also a question about access, because this is something that people own. This is not something they need to get. This is some people practice this in the everyday, and it's just a matter of actually building that social currency together, and organizing around that shared purpose to be able to do this. There's and then throughout history, I think that has been kind of also a way to kind of oppose more formalized structures where there are power structures that wouldn't grant you access. So by organizing, you can kind of break those kind of barriers. This is kind of what we're interested in a way. No? Yeah. So I can stop sharing. You want to add?
Yeah, I'd just like to add also. I mean, obviously this all sounds quite nice and like romantic in a sense, but there is also this other aspect to it, which is the way that the governments do co-opt these powers or these traditions for their own needs, in order to either one, abdicate responsibility, and also two, to actually basically get people to do things as a form of kind of coercion of the people, in a sense, like appeal to that sense of bayanihan, or appeal to the sense of mutual responsibility, so that they wouldn't need to provide the services that they are required to do so. So as we've seen in the pandemic, the name of the law which grants the government its power, at least in the Philippines, uses the term specifically bayanihan, they call it the Bayanihan to Kill as One Act. And this law grants the government so much power that is now so difficult to remove, because they have enforced the way to lock down people at home and have given them power to kind of use police force to be able to enforce these lockdowns. So in a way, there's appealing to the nature of people to say that, hey, everyone needs to do their part to contribute, but also suddenly sneak in this power that they were not easily granted before.
Similar in Norway, also we've been our very conservative government is trying to kind of use Dugnad to get people to agree to incentives and changes that somehow benefits the upper percentage of income earners in Norway. But so these are important traditions that people practice, but they can be co-opted. So we think it's really important to talk about these kind of platforms to work together in a critical way, so they don't become also tools to control ourselves, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, so for the Philippine Pavilion, this is something that we've been exploring for about 12 years now, right? So we've been doing this in different countries and through different traditions in Norway, Philippines, Vietnam, and
Brazil.
And Brazil. And for this project, for the Biennale, we've actually teamed up with a community in the Philippines to practice this tradition, to discuss it, and to make something that becomes relevant for the community that we worked with. And over a series of workshops through this tradition, we kind of identified collectively at the year before the Biennale a program that we designed and built in the Philippines. It was shipped over here. And after the Biennale, this building will then go back again to
Pavilion. So it's like to share it with you. So this is the library and that conflict mediation space that we designed and built with the community. And as Alex was saying, it will be dismantled and shipped back also to the Philippines to become permanently part of the community. So what is important here is that I think it was about for us to try and create a platform by which we could design and build something together. So in the sense of horizontality, I think it makes sense because typically people think that the expert or the architects or the people who are with the knowledge are the ones kind of dictating things for the community, where in this sense we're trying to
we need to
create.
We have to move a little bit. Sorry, please, just 1 second.
Okay. So maybe that's a good moment to wrap it up a little bit. I believe that Alex and Sudar can listen to us right now, or at least I hope, or they will arrive back at our conversation. There's some things happening in Arsenale. Thanks to you guys. I hope if you can hear us. But the nice point that they mentioned is somehow at the very end is that indeed in their exhibition there is this approach to look for these very local traditions. Globally, somehow try to map them in different contexts in different countries and look that precisely they have very similar structures of cooperation, yet of course they originated completely independently of themselves. So something that is probably at the stake in here when we are speaking about the horizontality in the work of the platforms is precisely this tension between the potential of working at the global scale, but at the same time maintaining the sort of identity of whether this is identity of the community or whether this is the culture of the community, their customs, and maybe a quality that is worth representing. I don't know how for you, if maybe this is, oh yeah, good to have you back.
Hello.
You're there with us. Okay. Could you hear us in the meantime? Sudar? Okay, so just going back to this, I was thinking maybe that we can try to unpack it all just maybe by going through this simple answering ourselves maybe this sort of, or reflecting upon this simple idea of the tension between the locality and the globality in each of the pavilions, no? In the way in which like departing already from the Philippine pavilion, there's somehow local conditions are something that is still worth preserving, but maybe not necessarily preserving, but finding a way of of developing of it in continuity, somehow maintaining its possibility to keep it still alive. And what kind of potentials maybe do you see in terms of understanding your exhibitions and maybe the platforms in this sense, the horizontal relationships in negotiating between the local and global?
I don't know. I don't know if I can, sorry to pop in, but I mean, both of these projects are so amazing and so interesting, and I've loved visiting your pavilions. But I was thinking quite a lot, especially when, you know, I think when we talk a lot about globalization, the issue becomes the way that globalization operates through completely obscuring the logistics, right? And the presence of these local knowledges and these situated knowledges, and kind of functioning through a system of scale that kind of works to completely obscure what I don't want to call it the miniature. I'm kind of using like a philosophical term there, but kind of to obscure those sort of those smaller networks that are necessary in order to produce what we understand as the global or the globalization. And then that's when bringing into a representative format or kind of showing kind of the materialities of these logistics becomes like really important. Again, I'm kind of speaking more in the sense of networks and kind of more in the discourse in the digital way. But I think that becomes really important. And as well, especially when Alex and Sudar were talking about the way that these like, you know, forms of mutual support and these different systems and structures that are used like within local communities, the way that those have been co-opted by particular governments in order to like take away, you know, accountability for providing public services or what have you, or the way that kind of these narratives are skewed or distorted for particular purposes. That's when it becomes really clear to me that that kind of a material presentation or kind of a material study or material histories of the way that these kind of support movements existed, how they exist, again, as you spoke about, this attention to craft, like really showing, really building, and kind of to take away from that sort of the characteristic feature of capitalism, which is extreme growth and then extreme abstraction, right? So you don't see the details, you don't see the mechanisms, you don't see the labors. It's kind of these matrices of invisibility. And what I really love about both of your exhibitions is that there is this attention to visibilizing the local, to visibilizing the movement, even in just the way that you describe the construction of the table and the different pieces that have come to it, the way that there's really this attention to the kind of the material processes that are necessary into producing what we understand as a platform, or what we understand as sort of these movements between the local and the global.
I think for me also, thank you, Carmen, it's how we understand how these things are distributed and how this distance between the local and the global can be sort of inhabited, but by starting from what is already there and what is already like happening, and to really support the communities to continue and to be able to bring what they do in a way that makes sense for today, to make it more contemporary. So yeah, for us, it was like looking at this, how to inhabit this bridge, like between the past and the present, and how to try to promote the visibility for what is there and how it can sort of continue.
It's also really interesting that, I mean, all the conversations we're having are on the global scale, the conferences like COP26 and other bigger kind of initiatives are global movements, but and we also need to comply to the regulation, the framework that is applied on us as architects. But again, what is really interesting is that the local scale and the social networks are actually formed over time, and I think you can really see the beauty in the Philippine pavilion, for example, that the kind of inhabitants take authorship in the project, and it's really interesting to see it, and how could we scale up from the local into a kind of global network of operating as architects without homogenizing everything we do.
I don't know. I think all one has to do really is to take it even within this kind of homogenization that is kind of more regimented and usually more planned across the city. All one has to do is just take notice of all these kind of the DIY moments where the inhabitants just pull like a table or a situation or a chair and you know, the need of the community and kind of anchor whatever is happening in the city, anchor it to that kind of locality. It's not about the two extremes. It's, yeah, like Avagoras was saying, how do you inhabit that space between them?
So Dar and Alex, any thoughts about it? This mediation also? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think in our case, what we really found is you know, helpful. Like you're saying, you kind of need. Sorry, we got kicked out of our pavilion. Some people had to visit again, so we had to move out. Sorry. And as I was saying, like I think slippery, yes. It's nice to have this keys to get into the project, in the sense like to have a connection that is immediately understood, and in a sense, a tradition that exists in most countries already as a kind of natural response to kind of a condition that we face together, is something that we feel like more easily allows this local knowledge to be embedded within the architecture, as opposed to something that, you know, you have to create from scratch. So whenever we do pick or whenever we are trying to kind of look for collaborators in the projects, it's important to us that it always has that connection to some sort of structure already that they have in practice, and also as maybe in a traditional sense, so that we can connect to it and kind of more easily access that knowledge that is embedded already in the context.
I mean, like the thing with digital platforms is that we really don't own the algorithms that kind of control. These are owned by specific people. But I mean, what we're trying to understand with these traditions is how people themselves own the kind of algorithm of how it works. But every culture and every country would have their own algorithm of like how to organize this thing, how to make these decisions, and how to. But there's barriers here also that needs to be broken, whether it's gender, whether it's class, whether it's, you know, within the cultures. But it's how you can start that process for negotiating those boundaries, but where we are not the ones introducing the algorithm, basically. So that's the kind of discussion. But I came a little bit from sliding from the left here to the screen
to the center. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. During actually this exchange, I was thinking also about the fact that, of course, we are still speaking about the communities, and communities used to have their scale. I mean, in the terms of size that you can imagine. Of course, the digital platforms, you know, make this, since they are digital, somehow they never engage with the idea of the limit of the space, unless, of course, the platform is having kind of imposed, you know, sort of regulation of it. But I was thinking maybe that looking at the tables in the Cyprus pavilion, that the very interesting fact about them is that this is somehow in the plan looks like a continuous table, but of course all of them are fractions, but at the same time they're shifted in their heights. And I was thinking if this idea to represent it somehow in this way as a kind of surface which is fragmented in a way, but surface which also marks their own somehow point of reference, is it also the idea to somehow resemble the scale of the community, that somehow they have the line of the connection, there is a friction between them, but at the same time it's a way to somehow exemplify that there needs to be a sort of differentiation to maintain the, I don't know whether it's identity or a scale in a sense of presence of the number of let's say people limit, you know. Is there any, do you have any kind of reflection on this decision also, like in the sense of representation of the pavilion? Yeah.
Yeah, for us it's that, yeah, it's, you know, it's for us it was the archipelago, so the islands kind of forming a whole, and this idea that the table is not, it's these fragments that it's not a unified kind of whole and everything becomes homogenized as a straight surface. It's these fragments that come together to create a whole. And I don't know, maybe Nasius can talk
I mean,
about it more?
if we're gonna analyze the plan and talk about there's different scales. So there's overall like there's 4 different tables in a way, which are later fragmented, which are later you have the objects being embedded, and we had these discussions all together, thinking about this idea of soft joints, where the boundaries are kind of re-highlighted or blurred. Where the objects sit between 2 things. I mean, there's metaphors that we try to embed in the project, and hopefully people can read this idea that things can exist themselves, but they're always in relation to other things, and whether that's community, whether that's people operating together. Yeah, we really wanted to highlight these ideas.
Or like maybe like the bleeding edge that Carmen was kind of referring to.
Yeah, I mean, it is really interesting because when we're talking about mediating between, or not mediating, but when we're talking about globalizing the local or localizing the global, right? Or kind of that movement between these different scalar states, if you can call it that, the mechanism required to do that movement, I think, has to be a platform, if that makes sense. The platform is what mediates between those 2 scales. But then it's interesting as well when we talk about the idea of parts and wholes, because I think about the most original the original definition of hegemony, of what power is a system of parts and wholes where some parts are put above other parts in order to distort the view of the whole. So there's a very fine line, again, a very bleeding edge between a platform becoming hegemonic, if we're thinking about it in a philosophical way, of a platform becoming a kind of hegemony. And then that's when the idea of materializing the different parts and how the parts work together becomes so fundamental in terms of re-signifying and reappropriating what the platform means. And that's why, like, for instance, in our exhibition, I realized I showed no images of our exhibition, which I would like to do if it's possible, because I didn't, but in, let me see if I can, how do I share my screen? Can I? Yeah, I think I can.
Yeah, you can, definitely.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Can everyone see? You know, for somebody who studies digital technology, I'm so, I struggle so much with it anyway, but can everyone see this?
Yeah, it's
yeah.
easy.
So this is in one of the rooms of our pavilion where we have one of our collages, and I mean, I felt really excited, Rafa, when you mentioned the layers of the table in the Cyprus pavilion, because I'd never made this connection. But one of the reasons that we use the format of collage was we really wanted to draw emphasis again on this ambiguous space, on this bleeding edge between homogeneous aesthetic, if that makes sense, the fact that images can be layered on top of one another and it kind of all looks the same in a way, because they sort of are layered in this particular way, whilst at the same time kind of showing this sense of the micro, which helps form a sense of the macro, which again is kind of theoretically one of the main sort of issues of our exhibition. So in these different collages, what we did is we took over 4,000 different images of the platform city all around the world. So we went to 15 different cities and we're taking different images of co-working environments, Box Park, London. We were going, we were kind of traveling all around and trying to find this kind of representation of what the platform is. And then we layered these images on top of one another and kind of created this sort of archiscape of what the platform means. And in this image, this is what we call the off stage of platform urbanism. So these are all of the logistics and all of the spaces that exist in order to produce the platform city. So these are like the lines, the production lines of shipping containers, and the the laborers who have to transport the e-scooters. I don't know if you can really see properly, all of the distribution centers, the data centers. So this is kind of the platform world that is curated in order not to be seen. And we really wanted to use collage because collage really emphasizes this, again, the sense, the fundamental question, which is scale and which is kind of the balance between these different logistics. And then on the other side, wait, let me see if I can do this properly. Sorry, I'll just show one more and then I want to open it up again to everyone else. Okay, yeah. And then this is the on stage of platform urbanism, where you can really see that this is sort of the fantasy of sort of techno-capitalist salvation. It's a world where everything is easy, everything is fluid. There's lots of plants. There's lots of, it's kind of this very circular, it's this very networked architecture of participation, a utopia, an urban kind of platform utopia. And so we really kind of wanted to materially show these two sides of what the platform city is, what the problems are, what the potentials are, but really again, representation and kind of thinking about visual layering became very important to that.
Yeah, I remember seeing actually this collage in the pavilion, and the strong impression that first it makes on, I think, on a visitor in general, that it seems to be a computer-generated image as a kind of assemblage based on the, let's say, a genetic code of the image, that you have either public buildings and public spaces like the transportation hubs, like glass buildings with the very large scale of the transparency, or as you say, the space of logistics, space of production, space of transport, which somehow always kind of mediate this idea of platform. But in the end, this is a handmade collage, in fact, right? And also it has this kind of very interesting sophistication of that indeed communicating this kind of homogeneity through actual collection of this similar images. It's interesting to think about it, I mean, in terms of the Philippine pavilion, which is a kind of strong material object, right, as a kind of result of the very particular process, and an object that was, as you're saying, Sudar and Alex, also was built in particular place, constructed in the Philippines, transported to the Italy, and then later will come back, of course, into the Philippines back again. And from this point of view, how would you maybe somehow reflect upon the this idea of the representation and what you wanted to attempt somehow? You I remember that the pavilion itself was also kind of constructed somehow with an aim to think about the exhibition in Venice, right? But somehow also mediate the local needs of the people at place. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's true. Exactly right, Rafael. I think what we're really trying to do is that it's about kind of sharing the knowledge and also sharing the context of where this exhibition was going to be created. So at the start of our collaboration, it was very clear that this project was going to be for both the context of the site and also the context in Venice. So we shared with them, the whole theme of the exhibition, what the Biennale is, where it is, where it will be, who Hashim is, and what the topic was. And then we are actually also collaborating on this idea. And so they understood what the Biennale is now and what the space will be. So they knew that this building, whatever was going to be created, was also going to exist within the limits of this building, of the space, and also the constraints of the shipping costs and then the shipping method and the assembly and disassembly. So it was just about like sharing that in a clear way, that then the people in the community were all on the same page, and as with us, that we all were designing it for both contexts. And I think the value of creating the platform then is for this creating that space for the sharing of that knowledge. And I think that's how we can really design together and not just say that we're creating the frame only for the design. And in a sense, it's really co-designed.
But also what's interesting if you talk about the Biennale as a platform, as a cultural platform, to talk about potentials and solutions and opportunities. And, these are actually really, really important places where we should also bring in other people to be part of that discussion, because it shapes the discussion so much. Working with the community in Philippines, talking about how will we live together, like it's, at the end of the day, we all ask these questions, but within this kind of cultural context, I think it really opens up this kind of solution solving, we look at alternatives. We don't need to look at the pragmatics of it. So it's also an interesting kind of twist of perspective. Yeah.
And in terms of representation, I think what we really try to do is to allow the space for people to be able to even talk about the project on their own terms. So even like, for example, just at the opening, it was important for us that everyone was able to get a chance to speak about the project in the way that they saw it. So we had, I mean, ideally they would have been here for the opening, but the COVID
That was the plan.
that was really the plan. And four members from the community were supposed to come over and say their opening remarks also for the pavilion, but unfortunately we just had to do it by, you know, like the Zoom recording. And then still, at least we get multiple perspectives of the same process, of the same object we're creating together. And I think that diversity or that plurality is as much as we can hope for, really, in terms of how we can represent different voices in the architecture or in the process.
But in the Cyprus pavilion, you also had a meal, right? You were making food, and you were practicing this pavilion. You were using it. You were celebrating. And you were creating these real meetings. And I think this is kind of what this really is about. You know, it's using this Biennale and our exhibitions as platforms also for this, you know, discussions.
Well, if it wasn't for COVID, our intention was to completely kind of open up the space to as many people, even the other pavilions, to just use it. We wanted it to be busy all the time, because after all, we had created a table. But yeah, there were events taking place in the Spiazzi before that are still kind of taking place now. Every opportunity we had, even during COVID, we took it.
I would like to return to the point that Carmen was talking about, and think possibly about like narratives of the periphery gathered in each of the pavilions that we are sort of explore here. On the one hand, we have the narratives coming from the Philippine pavilion, where we see these structures of mutual support, like as I understand them, like taking place in the peripheral areas of the country. And then on the other hand, like having all these data relations stored in a peripheral areas again, where like the clouds exist in physical form, and where we have, I mean, these data relations sort of stored and archived. And on the other hand, with our pavilion, where we gathered all the narratives and stories of individuals, but also collectives and cooperatives, in order to reimagine and re-envision future spaces for being together and working together. And I don't know, what would you like to sort of reflect on the notion of periphery, for example, and like thinking within the context of the center, which is the biennial, and how we sort of explore this notion through that.
I mean, I think also the idea of periphery is someone defining something as a periphery. But I mean, I grew up in, you know, not in the capital of Norway. I grew up in the rural parts, and to me, that was pretty much the center of the world for a long time. It's just that from the perspective of those in the capital, it's the periphery. So, I mean, I think it's really about re-centering, you know, the center of the world to the places actually where people live, rather than those that control and manipulate people. But
in the other sense, so we're from the Philippines, and so in the sense, I would say that any country in Europe is the center and the Philippines is the periphery. So
there's scales of peripheries, right?
You are the center and I am the periphery.
But we're the center, so that's the thing.
Yeah, no, but I'm from Manila, so I'm also the center relative to when people say they are from the province and they feel like they're the periphery and I am the center. So there are relationships also in that we, you know, maybe have to be aware of, at least, so we can, you know, kind of mediate somehow.
Yeah, so in a way, I think there's so many layers of peripheries and centers, and we kind of need to kind of have that discussions, I think, constantly.
Even for us, a metaphor that we were returning to was really like every center a periphery, every periphery a center. I mean, if you see Cyprus geographically, it's really the center with its neighboring countries in the Middle East. But then in relation to Europe, I mean, we're really afar, but then how the center and periphery shifts constantly in order to define identity and like a sense of belonging, really.
Yeah,
it's also what Rafael was mentioning in the very beginning about the horizontality. I think how we kind of picture these relationships being hierarchical, but actually it's what Rafael was saying. if you affect one, it affects the rest. So really it's a horizontal kind of relationship. And the more we start to put that in our vocabulary, the more we will start to respond to it, right?
Yes, that's very true. I remember this this initial conversation that we had up there. Of course, in case of Polish Pavilion, for instance, this also came up as an aspect deriving from the relations of the central to the periphery. But here, central and periphery being geographic, but at the same time thematic. Thinking of the countryside as neglected subject, marginalized subject, with instantly in the debates and the architectural culture became a sort of periphery. So even the aspect of, you know, like mediating what is central, what is periphery, just for a change of perspective, allowed us also to rethink it in the terms of the scales. And of course, the collapse of the scales leads us to this sort of horizontal relationship between the particular, you know, we call them, I was actually thinking for a moment how to call it, because we are used to call them spatialities, not necessarily scales, because it's hard to somehow within the, for instance, the landscape of the countryside, to give a proper distinction where one scale ends and where the other begins in terms of this kind of architecturally classically defined scales. That's why thinking about them, for instance, in terms of architecture, it's like territory, settlement, and building as a kind of simplification for thinking about them. But returning to the idea of the periphery and the center, maybe this is also the point. Like, from which point of view did you notice within your exhibitions that there is a need to strengthen the peripheral subjects and peripheral themes precisely by the pavilions as a tools to exhibit and as a tools to somehow underline something that is not mentioned in the debates, maybe neglected in the debates?
I don't know. I think it sort of becomes a methodological question. I think it was really interesting, Alex, what you were saying about it's who defines what is the periphery. And in the same way, when thinking about scale is a relational system. So there's not, you know, it's something scale is something that, you know, depends on, it depends on the sort of the context for which you are establishing that relational system, if that makes sense. What is the large scale or the small scale? How do you scale up? What does sort of, already these ideas are like very abstract. I mean, the idea behind us was less trying to visibilize the periphery and more provide a space so that those who identify themselves with the periphery have a space in order to represent themselves, right? Instead of taking that, and that's the idea of kind of what platforms are, is it's I mean, in the way that if we're taking the platform and it's sort of non-capitalized upon kind of metaphorical horizontal surface, as we describe it, it's about opening up space for the dissemination of situated knowledge and what that means. And it's about trying to create a research methodology as well as curators in trying to understand how do we open up these spaces and why, and whose voice is heard louder than other voices, and how do we create a space or create a world where we can allow for this horizontality of discourse and for people to represent themselves in the way that they want to exactly. That makes sense.
Exactly, yeah. And for us, it was very important to treat the project within the Biennale context, like already as something we can take resources and use them to create this differential ecology. So this comes into looking at also like exhibition practices and how is this hegemony created and then disseminated. And then to try to complicate that and change that, which I think all projects here are doing.
Maybe coming up, I know, Alex, if you want to add something to that.
No, go on.
Okay. Maybe coming to a slow closure of the discussion, I was thinking about the aspect that probably, especially as you just mentioned right now, also Eva Goras, within the context of the Biennale, I noticed that all the three exhibitions in the conversation are not very much, are not at all, and highlighting any kind of showcase like aspects for architecture, but rather a kind of phenomena of community in collaboration somehow. And I don't know if this is also came up to your observation that I would say that even most of the exhibitions at this year Biennale are not attempting to showcase the architectures or the examples, but rather strengthen the idea of the collaborations and network relationships between the communities. And as it seems as if this was somehow, I don't know if we were only now in the air, but the context of the pandemic has even more stressed the urgency to think and to maybe rethink this kind of social relations. And maybe from that point of view, do you think that this is precisely like maybe the urgency of the time that we are in, that that basically the pavilions are somehow without being later referring one to another, somehow are still reflecting about these subjects today? And how do you think that your exhibitions somehow would like to maybe push further this subject, or ask a particular questions in the local context, maybe even?
I mean, as a discourse, I think for a long time, the way we practice was very individual, and consciously, I think the architecture has changed in itself, and I think these complexities of like how does it actually relate to people definitely lead us to allow for more players to enter the process, the inhabitants, anthropologists, which we definitely need to start taking into account in order to create something socially sustainable that actually people can inhabit. I don't know, there's a lot of conversations in the way that projects are being developed on urban scales, big developers owning land and coming up with schemes which really influence cities. But I think the importance of re-highlighting this idea of including a kind of bottom-up approach, it's very important. I know it might sound as a cliche, but definitely allowing more people into the process without saying, okay, they're experts in this and that, but actually allowing the architecture to form from these collaborations or discussions, relations. I think it's the way to go forward.
Any other thoughts on that?
I agree. I think it's a great point.
Yeah, I think that was some.
Yeah. All right. So thanks very much for meeting up today and for the actually continuing the conversation, keeping it alive. So that's it. I will be stopping recording for now, maybe. Thank you all for the meeting.
Thank you for having me.
Sure.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.